The First Stone, Chapter 14. It looked different than he thought it would. Taller, more like an apartment building than a hospital, but then again, what did he know about hospitals? Weren't they just places people went to die? Standing at the entrance to the Halifax Rehabilitation Center on the first day of August, Reeve felt someone dance on his grave. Goose flesh marching up his back and arms despite the warmth of the morning, he hoped that grave dancer was his grandfather. Hoped he was dancing somewhere hot. Red flames, licking his toes while the soles of his feet singed and charred, then fell away from his bones in blood-blackened silvers. Something wrong? Koval asked. No. Reeve moved forward, and an electric sensor opened the door. Koval followed him inside. A man in his early 60s met him in the foyer. Hi, I'm Jim Granter. You must be Mr. Koval. We spoke on the phone? Frank, Koval said, shaking his hand. Pleased to meet you. He turned to Reeve. This is Reeve Kennedy. Jim Granter was the polar opposite of Frank Koval. Where Koval was tall and trim, Granter was short and fleshy, at least 40 pounds overweight, but where Koval's hair was thick and dark, Granter's was sparse and threaded with white. But what Granter lacked in physical stature, he more than made up for in exuberance. His voice was filled with music, and every sentence seemed to end with an exclamation point. Reeve, my boy, he said. Glad to have you here. We always have room for volunteers. Yeah, Reeve mumbled. Granter took Reeve's hand and pumped it 4 or 5 times, then clapped him on the shoulder and led him towards the elevator. This young man will be fine here with me, Frank, he called over his shoulder. We'll take good care of him. Press the call button, and the doors of one car immediately slid open. He and Reeve stepped inside. Reeve felt as if he'd been hijacked by a sidewalk Santa on speed. He kept his face forward, tried to ignore the heat that was working itself up his neck to his face. Koval was still standing in the foyer, watching him, and even from the elevator. Reeve could see a muscle twitch at the corner of his mouth. The son of a was trying not to laugh. A-hole. So I'll be back around 4 to pick you up, okay? Said Koval. That's just dandy. Granter enthused, he turned to Reeve. Tons to do, my boy, tons to do. Don't you worry, we'll feed you. The elevator doors began to close. Good luck, Reeve, Koval called. Bite me, you bastard. When the elevator arrived at the 5th floor, Jim Granter was still talking, and Reeve felt like the target of a firing squad, a barrage of words instead of bullets, pelting him endlessly. Granter was himself, volunteer. I'm the greeter, he said. Granter the greeter, they call me here. He'd explained that he came to the rehab at least a couple of times a week, and more often when new volunteers were expected. As they stepped off the elevator at the 5th floor, Granter was outlining for Reeve the various levels in the facility. The first floor included the X-ray department and the cafeteria. The second floor contained the physio gym and pool. The third floor was a general recreation area, and the 4th floor housed occupational therapy and several doctors' offices. The 5th floor contained more offices and the cardiac rehab program, and the 6th floor was the musculoskeletal trauma unit, which also included beds for patients who had suffered brain injuries. The 7th floor contained beds for patients in spinal cord injuries who had had amputations and were coming in for prosthesis. The 8th floor, Granter said, was set aside for stroke patients. Following Granter down a long hallway, Reeve was suddenly overwhelmed by the variety of injuries the human body could sustain. His stomach lifted uneasily, and he imagined Judge Thomas somewhere laughing her head off right that moment. He suddenly wished for the opportunity to inflict an injury or two on her. Here we are, Granter exclaimed. They'd come to the office of Shelby Simpson, the recreation therapist who was in charge of coordinating volunteers. Her door was open, but Granter knocked anyway. A woman working at a desk looked up and smiled, then got up and came around with her hand extended to Reeve. So you're our newest volunteer, she said as she shook his hand. I'm Shelby. Very nice to meet you, Reeve. In her late 30s, Shelley Simpson was an attractive woman, tall and willowy, with soft features and even softer voice, but her handshake was surprisingly firm. In some weird way, she reminded Reeve of a female version of Frank Koval, but he couldn't say why. It certainly didn't seem like an a-hole, at least not yet. But give her time. All any of them needed was a little time. Reeve finished shaking her hand, stood there awkwardly unsure what to say. I've got more people to meet, so I'll just leave you in Shelby's capable hands, Granter all but shouted. You take care of Reeve, and he was off. The office was suddenly silent, and Reeve could hear a slight ringing in his ear. He shook his head, and Shelley smiled. Jim is one of the most effervescent people you'll ever meet, she said, pulling up a chair for Reef to sit in. She sat in one beside him. That means loud, you're right, he said, glancing around the room as he sat down. Its neatness and organization reminded him of Colville, too. The frames on the wall, which two of held photographs of children, while in the third contained a certificate of some kind, seemed perfectly parallel to the floor and each other. Shelley laughed softly. Jim's been helping us out here since he ever retired. Then 10 years before that, he was one of our patients, which is what makes him such a terrific volunteer. He knows firsthand what goes on in our facility, knows what the patients are experiencing even before they do. When there's a patient, what did he break? He was helping a friend build a garage, and he fell from the roof to the concrete footing. He broke his back. Reef muttered. Then he noticed the immediate disapproval on the woman's face. Sorry, he said. She nodded. You'll have to watch the language here, Reef. Yeah, he said, thinking of Koval's extra jobs. I've been trying. You just surprised me. I thought a broken back meant you were paralyzed for life. Fortunately, Jim's spinal cord wasn't severed, but his injuries required months of extensive physiotherapy. It must be quite the place, he thought. Then he realized he'd said that comment out loud. She smiled. We're very proud of the work we do here, and we're very grateful for the work our volunteers do, too. Reef frowned, looking down at his hands. He said, you should probably know. She interrupted him. I know you were assigned here by court order. I don't know any of the particulars, and I don't really care to know them. Reef looked at her closely, to see if she was telling the truth. Couldn't. The only thing I do need to know, she continued, is that you're ready and willing to help out. Our staff is far too busy to babysit someone who doesn't want to be here in the first place. She paused, clearly waiting for an answer to the question she had not asked. If it were up to him, Reef thought, he'd be heading towards the elevator right now. No, he did not want to be here, or anywhere like that. But it wasn't up to him, was it? And he thought of, if he had to be somewhere, it might as well be this place. The sooner he got started with this, the sooner it'd be over. The woman obviously mistook his hesitation for uncertainty. If it's any help, Reef, she said quietly, you're not the first person the court has assigned here. In fact, some of them have turned out to be our best volunteers. Reef wasn't looking to win Volunteer of the Year at this place or anywhere else, just to do his time and get out. But there was no need to tell her that. She could think he was Saint Christopher if she wanted to. As long as she kept off his back, they'd get along fine. I'm ready, he said. Shelley spent the next half hour explaining the various ways the volunteers helped out. They were not permitted, of course, to assist with any kind of medical or therapeutic procedures, since these could be performed only by qualified personnel. But there were many other duties that focused on improving the quality of life for patients at the facility. Some volunteers, she explained, are more comfortable doing one-on-one work, visiting with patients who don't have families close by, for example. People like that really appreciate having someone to talk to or to play cards with. And in the good weather, volunteers often take them outside for walks or just sit with them for a bit in the sun. She went on to explain that others preferred to work with groups of patients. We have volunteers to do things like that. Get a group of people together and show a movie downstairs on the third floor, make popcorn, things like that. Then there are volunteers who do programs in the evening. Bingo, for example. And sometimes they bring in people they know who can demonstrate activities like painting, craft, design, you name it. Shelley smiled. We even had someone do archery with one group. Besides their involvement with individual patients and organized activities, volunteers also assist the staff directly. They help set up barbecues, accompany patients from one part of the hospital to another, help them get their food, and so on. The list is endless. At least you won't have to worry about the time being long. The staff will keep you hopping. When she had finished, she asked if Reeve had any preferences regarding how he might help out. His preference, of course, was to put as much distance as he could between himself and every gimp in this place. But he thought for a moment. I don't see myself doing things with a group, he said. Maybe one-on-one with somebody, or I could just help out the staff doing some of the things you told me. I'm sure Jim filled you in already on different kinds of injuries his facility treats. Any particular floor you think you'd be more comfortable working on? Reef had long forgotten which floor was which, but he knew what he didn't want to do. I don't want to work with the stroke patients. What makes you say that? Reef paused. Wasn't sure how to continue. Then, my grandfather had a stroke. It's what killed him. Oh, I see. You were sure, of course. She couldn't see. He'd actually been grateful for that stroke, had in fact once wished it would come sooner. It was the one thing that finally stopped the drinking, the rages, the flood of empty threats he'd never stood up to, never challenged. Wished he could have, but never did. If he'd believed in God, he'd have thought that stroke was an answer to an unspoken prayer, but he knew it wasn't, not when he saw what it did to his grandmother. He'd hated watching her look for any sign of improvement, any reason to hope. She held her husband's hands for days in the hospital, rubbing it softly, all while talking to him, telling him over and over that everything was going to be all right. But it wasn't. Not then. Not ever. Even then, the cancer was growing inside her. I just hadn't told anyone yet. I don't assign new volunteers to that 8th floor anyway, Shelley continued, or the 7th, for that matter. Patients who have had strokes or lost limbs often require a level of patience and compassion that even professionals take a while to develop over time. Though, that's all right, Reef said. What about the he'd forgotten the term. Musculoskeletal. That's on the 6th floor. How about we put you there to start? Reef would have preferred she put him on a bus back to North Hills, but that wasn't going to happen. The judge hadn't made sure of that. Fine with me, he lied. After giving him a quick overview of the 6th floor and introducing him to the medical personnel in the musculoskeletal unit, Shelley Simpson had left him with a nurse named Carly Reynolds, who would put him to work almost immediately. We can always use another body around here to help out, she said. She glanced at her watch. In fact, I've got a job for you right now. You're on traffic control. He waited for an explanation. In the next few minutes, the elevator door is going to open and 2 wheelchairs are going to come out full tilt. She seemed to notice the surprise in his eyes and laughed. No, I'm not clairvoyant. It's just the 2 of my patients usually come up here for physio at the same time. And if someone isn't there to stop them, this hallway turns into an Indianapolis 500. As if on cue, the elevator binged and the doors opened, revealing 2 people, a young woman and a man about Carly's age, in a wheelchair, each jockeying to be first. Hold it, Carly ordered, sticking her hand out like a crossing guard. 2 looked up and grinned sheepishly. Busted, the young woman said. Reef said the nurse. Meet the bane of my existence, Brett Turner. And this is her partner in crime, Ron Sheffield. Guys, this is Reef Kennedy, hall cop. She punched the last 2 words out for emphasis. Reef here is going to help me make sure everyone observes the speed limit. She leaned toward Reef and murmured, whatever you do, don't get your feet in front of them. Turning to her partner, the young woman groaned. Looks like the hall Nazi has reinforcements. We're screwed. Her partner laughed, so did the nurse. Reef moved forward, keeping an eye on his feet. It turned out that Brett was much help as she was a hindrance. She gave Reef a tour of some of the other floors, including the 2nd and 3rd, where she said the real action was. It was when he saw the physio gym that Reef began to wonder if he'd be able to handle this volunteering thing after all. The patients he saw there were a far cry from Brett Turner. An old man sat hunched over in his wheelchair, pulling on a rope attached to a weight, and despite the encouragement he was getting from therapists working with him, despite the fact that the weight couldn't have been more than a couple of pounds, it was all he could do to pull the rope a few inches to his right. A middle-aged woman was attempting to walk between 2 parallel bars, but had managed a little more than halting. Snail-paced shuffle. At the far end of the gym, a man in his late 20s or early 30s was trying to walk up a ramp whose incline was minimal. But even from the door, Reef could hear him groaning with exertion. Across from him, on the far wall, was a basketball net, and Reef thought whoever had hung it once had Christ's sixth sense of humor. It was obvious that no one here would be using it. The 3rd floor, which contained the general decoration area, was much less depressing. Many of the walls found on the other floors were absent here, allowing for a large open area beyond the elevators that served as an entertainment center. The room contained 3 large sofas and several armchairs and recliners, separated here and there by tables covering with books and magazines. Off to the left were higher tables on which lay a chess set, cribbage board, and assorted games. To the right was a large screen projection TV with VCR and DVD player, and near the windows at the far end stood a regulation-sized pool table. He thought briefly about Jink and Bigger, and knew they'd have a ball on the 3rd floor. Momentarily pictured them hanging out there, and shook his head to clear that image. Those 2 would level the place. He also thought about Scar, but it reminded him of her, not because of her hair, where Scar's was the red of kids' crayons. Her was much lighter, more blonde than red. No, the similarity lay more in their manner, completely genuine. What you saw was what you got. During the tour, Brett introduced Reeve to a number of patients, most of whose names he forgot the minute she said them. So focused was he on their various physical limitations. It was like a freak show, only free. Many were missing something, an arm or a leg. Others had all parts but seemed to have a life of their own, or no life at all. Most of the time he looked away, but not from any courtesy on his part. They creeped him out, and every one of them knew Brett. She's a wild one, warned a bald man with a handlebar mustache who was slowly pushing a metal walker down the hallway. Nearly knocked me down twice this week already. Yeah, well, next time signal when you're turning. Brett retorted impishly. Reeve was surprised people weren't pissed off at her. If he said that kind of thing she did, he'd sure get a dirty look, or worse. But everyone she met seemed to enjoy her comments, and many stopped to chat. Watching her carrying on with the other patients, he wondered what had brought her to the rehab. Shelley Simpson hadn't told him, but he couldn't ask. So, he said later, as he rolled her wheelchair toward the elevator for the ride back up to the 6th floor. You fall down some stairs or something? Brett turned to him and looked and grinned. You're not real subtle, are you? Reeve reddened, unsure if he'd offended her. Look, or something, Brett said. Huh? You asked if I fell down some stairs or something. Reeve was surprised. Off a roof, he asked. Out of an airplane, she said. Yeah, right. No, really, I did. Fell out of an airplane? He waited for the punchline. Actually, I jumped. Look, Reeve said, not bothering to mask his annoyance. If you don't want to tell me, I was skydiving. My parachute didn't open. You're shitting me. It was out of his mouth before he realized he said it. I mean, Brett laughed. No, I'm not shitting you. Actually, it was my first time skydiving. Sam, that's my guy. He warned me not to, but I'd always wanted to try it. So I paid to take a course. On the last day, everybody got one jump. Some luck, eh? My only jump and chute didn't open. Reeve remembered something he'd seen in a movie. Isn't there another parachute, he asked. The reserve, yeah. It got tangled in my lines. Reeve shook his head slowly, stopped pushing the wheelchair, and moved around in front of the girl. Christ, he breathed. What was it like? The falling or the landing? Jesus, well, both. At first I thought, this isn't happening to me. You know, like those nightmares you have and you wake up drenched in sweat? Reeve nodded. He had lots of nightmares like that when he was younger, and a few since the hearing, since seeing those pictures. Then I panicked, forgot everything I learned in the course. No, I almost did that, too, which when you think of it, might actually have made it for a softer landing. Reeve grinned. The chick had balls, big ones. Then what, he asked. Then I got myself under control and started trying all things we've been taught, which didn't work, she shrugged. Found out later that what happened to me was just a flunky. The main chute was almost always works, and on the off chance it doesn't, the reserve takes over with no problem. It was just a weird combination of events, but hey, I guess when you jump out of an airplane you should be ready for weird things, right? Right, he exclaimed, then remembered where he was. It was nearly noon when New Reeve returned Brett to the 6th floor. They found Carly, who thanked him for keeping Terror occupied and making the hallway safe for the rest of us. She gave him a lunch voucher and told him to grab a bite to eat in the cafeteria. You know where that is? She asked. 1st floor, right? Carly smiled. You learn fast. You're gonna work out just fine here, Reeve. Reeve flushed. That was the 3rd time this morning he turned red for some reason or other. Wouldn't Scar have loved to see that? He thought, then realized that was the 2nd time she had come in mind that day. For a moment, he wondered where Scar was, what she was doing. Well, Reeve, said Brett, I was looking forward to seeing more of you. But there's little chance of that now. He looked at her. Why not? She nodded at the lunch voucher. Carly's sending you to the cafeteria. Clearly the woman is trying to kill you. The nurse raised her clipboard threateningly, and Brett wheeled around and sped down the hallway. Nice meeting you, Reeve, she called over her shoulder before disappearing into her room. So how was your first day? Koval asked when Reeve opened the door and slid into the truck. Reeve didn't answer right away. Finally. Okay. Koval pulled the truck out onto the Winter Street, came to the lights on the Spring Garden Road, and turned right, heading down towards the harbor. What you expected, he asked. You wanted a play-by-play? Asked Reeve. Think maybe I should take a video camera next time and tape for the sharing sessions? Koval didn't say anything for a bit. Satisfied, Reeve watched the city slide by. Warm air rushed through the open windows and mingled with the traffic fumes, with the undeniable smells of midsummer. Reef thought about Bigger and Jink. He wondered what they were doing on such a nice day. Not wheeling Gimps around, that was for damn sure, or reading to vegetables, which was how he spent the afternoon. You have some visitors coming later, Cole said. Reef turned. What do you mean visitors? Friends of yours? Jim, Scar, and Bigger? Jink? What? Reef breathed a loud, desired sigh. Not Jim. Drink. Oh. They drove in silence. Before long, Koval struck pulled onto the span of the Murray McKay Bridge. He could have taken the McDonald Bridge, but once on the Dartmouth side of the Murray McKay, it was only a couple of minutes to the 118, and then a straight haul to Waverley. In a moment, they were high above the water, and Reef could see dozens of sailboats dotting the Bedford Basin to the west and beyond that. Outbound vehicles lined up on Magazine Hill. People playing, working, living their lives. Thought I wasn't allowed to have visitors, he said finally. Traffic on the span was heavy, and a blue Grand Am cut in ahead of them, forcing Koval to brake hard to keep from rear-ending them. To Reef's surprise, Koval showed no impatience, didn't even honk his horn. Not at the beginning, Koval agreed, and no unsupervised visits for the first 6 months, but I thought it might be good for you to see them. I talked to your social worker about it, and he agreed. Reef mulled that over, knew somehow that his continued refusal to join in that nightly whine and whimper was a part of this, as if bringing his friends in would get him to open up. Make him. How did Koval put it? More likely to disclose. Such BS. Anyway, Greg offered to bring them over this evening for a bit. Told him I thought you earned it. When Reeves snorted disdainfully, Koval continued, Look, if you don't want to see them, just say that word. Reeve turned away, looked east down to the harbor past the shipyards, the MacDonald Bridge, McNab's, and George Islands at the Atlantic Ocean beyond them all. Even now, he could see the bank of offshore fog moving in. It's okay, he said. The truth was, though, he didn't feel okay. Thought he wouldn't let Koval know that. For some reason, the idea of seeing his friends again suddenly made him uneasy. Maybe it was because he hadn't returned Scar's calls. Yeah, that was probably it. He drummed his fingers on the doorframe, watched as the water beneath them fell away and became land.